Hello, my name is Marjaneh Rouhani, and I'm very much honored to be in your presence. Today is Sunday, July 10th, 2022, and it's equivalent of our Iranian 19th year, and the year is 2581. And in this program, which is the constitutional movement, we decided that we were going to contribute some of the program into our mental health and our medical issues, and it really, the whole world, and specifically Iranians, are in such urgent, dire need of help to really be recognized in their movement for freedom and liberation, that most of the weeks, with the permission of this great station that has really provided a freedom of speech to without any censorship, to reflect the thoughts and what the voices from within Iran say, in actuality, the translation of it. And if you watch most of the programs, some of them are from the 1960s, 50s, or the great era or the golden era where we were implementing the constitution, the mashrute, what we call, which is the conditional governance of a monarchy, which we call constitutional monarchy. But it was accomplished by great sacrifices of Iranian people to accomplish that after many, many years of fighting slavery, fighting oppression, fighting brutality. And then when Reza Shah the First came to power, with the encouragement and with the legislations from the Majlis or the parliament, and including all of the subsequent titles, including when we call Reza Shah the Great was given, the title that was given by the parliament. When we call Shahanshah Aryamehr or Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi Shahanshah Aryamehr, Aryamehr was, or the light of the Iranian nation, was given, assigned in appreciation of all the work he had done, along with his consultants and his cabinets and ministries and all these prime ministers that were actually under attack all the time by various ideologies, including communists. Everybody knows the Tudeh party that was connected completely to Russia and getting orders from Russia, which they acknowledge actually themselves during their various interviews, and also their books and their revelations anyhow. And the constitutional government, the constitutional monarchy, was always under attack by the Islamist extremists, and to the point that if you go back to the beginning of when Reza Shah the Great started to really implement healthcare and well-being of all humans from across the board, from all religions, backgrounds, no matter what area of Iran, and indiscriminately selecting kids who were really brilliant, and by meritocracy send them to abroad to get education. He was faced with a lot of resistance from the Islamic mullahs, which we call them mullahs now. Some people call them ahund, or anyhow, to the point that when the water was cleaned up and was in the pipelines and filtered to avoid all kind of diseases like cholera, all kinds of problems that we get with dirty water or infected water. The mullahs called it haram, means like it's against Sharia law. Then when the electricity came, it was the same thing. One of the most famous haram or against Sharias was when there was this horrid earthquake in Iran. And Shah of Iran, there are many clips, and I thank all the Iranians and very fair humanitarian people from across the world who are not born in Iran, but their love for humanity basically is like a magnet that pulls them towards Iran, because that's the birthplace of abolishing slavery. And the most famous one is during the earthquake. Shah of Iran basically with his prime minister and consultants and architects, they made a city for the people. They renovated buildings, brand new buildings that were earthquake resistant. That was incredible in technology at the time. And the mullahs came and denounced those buildings, saying that they are haram or against Sharia because the bathroom faces Mecca. So there was no winning, basically, in terms of advancing an agenda that's for humanity, equality, and abolishing slavery. Of course, it's very famously known that Reza Shah the Great, with one order, written hand order, abolished slavery selling, and which had become common during the Qajar time and the Qajar dynasty. He abolished human trafficking markets. However, truly, during the revolution of Shah and Millat, or what we call the White Revolution, and he called it White Revolution because it was devoid of bloodshed, and it was with the will of people, with the support of people. It was in connection, direct connection between Shah and the people. And he has this famous passage. He says, the bond between Shah and people is unbreakable. And that's true. It's a very short, beautiful sentence in Farsi that is پیوند شاه و مردم ناگسستنی است. In a sense, reflecting most of Iran's history in one sentence, that despite all obstacles, because of this sacred relationship that is able to promote meritocracy and bring people from across classes or across jobs or their professions into a different system to utilize. You can be born into a farmer family, but you may have a better talent to become a physician if your certain interests are different. And this system has worked for Iranians for many years, and that's why this program has a special importance, because Iranians during the past 43 some years have been shouting and calling for their own system, and never basically surrendered to this occupying system that was implemented or kind of implanted by an unknown person who did not even speak Farsi. And you can explore that in various documents that have been divulged by various intelligence services and forces. And also just we Iranians, because we have certain accents, certain way of speaking, certain way of using, maybe we even know when somebody is from a different area or different background by maybe one sentence. So Khomeini was a foreign entity there, and the crowd that brought him in, basically they were devoted and getting paid by outside forces that were divulged again by during the past 40 years, who was supporting them, and all the sabotages that have happened. But this program is not essentially developed to focus on what failed or what didn't work or the problems, because we know what the problems are. The problems are, for example, the I in Islamic Republic is commonly or pronounced as or stated as Iran, and Iranians just have separated themselves from every aspect of this real mafia governance or chaos. Basically, cannot even say governance, because at some point a governance would be able to provide ability to have businesses, ability to have access to various things to most people, not least number of people. And I mean, a normal governance, I guess, fascism or other extreme ideologies like communism, which Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah of Iran, Shahriar famously said this is the unity between the red forces and the black forces that are quite backwards, and nobody really was able to translate or understand what was he talking about. How would a Islamic content ideology be able to unite with communist ideology, because the way the propaganda worked, and propaganda or the media has a very, very important role, has had a very important role during the past 100 some years. To process that, it had to take many, many years after he said something. And that's why most Iranians have really come to the conclusion, after exploring many of Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah of Iran, Shahriar writing, interviews, really breaking the code of his messages to Iranians. And he spoke several languages, so it's a little bit difficult for us to sometimes who speak one language to interpret or translate accurately. But time, as he famously said, has cleared the sky, and we can see the sun shining on a brilliant, brilliant effort of humanitarian, how most people got access to being who they really want to be. And if you dream big, you can accomplish big. And using the Constitution, using the rule of law. And there is no example of violating the constitutional law in Iran during the Pahlavi era. And people, and Iran is essentially during the past few years, since social media has become commonplace for exchanging ideas, and internet has been accessible, and many Iranians have developed websites, they're expressing the truth and really shining light on true history, rather than coming through the narrow lens of some media who are supported by certain entities, or they may speak Farsi, but they may not have the best interest of the country, in the sense that we witness in other countries at the moment, and what we look at across the world in terms of the philosophy of humanity and establishing or settling in one place and developing a nation. We see this national movement because most nations are being threatened. There's an existential threat, not just to nationality or nations or borders, or just breaking up countries, but there's an existential crisis for being a human, being a man, being a woman, being a child, and all the normalcies that we've learned or we have come to know, to show empathy towards each other, and to be kind to each other, to have love for each other, which, you know, most nations have been through war, famine, throughout history, diseases. And throughout history, nations have crossed borders, helped each other with honesty, with dedication, just exemplary again and again. I want to remind this terrible World War II and World War I, actually, where a lot of people were forced migrated, and specifically during the World War II, when all of that Nazi ideology was roaming through Europe, and on the path of destruction, you know, peoples were displaced and the assets were confiscated, and such division among people, and neighbor reporting against neighbor. It was a really hard time in history, and ended up in Nuremberg. One which people are thinking that at some point, what is happening right now, because it's becoming an existential threat to humanity, we're going to end up in Nuremberg too. But people have, through crisis across borders, have helped each other, preserving their culture, preserving their language, preserving their borders, and sharing food, sharing medication, healthcare, humanity, shelter, water resources. So we are at a precipice of the situation where there's a lot of unknowns going on, and there's a lot of overload of information. And this overload of information that get bombarded from various entities, various sources, where we don't have really time to really dig up, you know, who's from where, and who's coming from what entity, and how these people are all connected somehow to each other through some sort of familial lineage across the oceans, and the Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean or the Indian Ocean, or, you know, how these people are basically have united against, have gained access to governance, and through their governance, they want to abolish all the rights and the laws that have been accomplished by a lot of bloodshed, a lot of prices that humanity has paid to reach or arrive to certain social contracts, to actually promote human right and put human right as a first stepping stone for everyday life. And we see that these social contracts are being sabotaged by the same people who have been supposedly elected by the people. And we just don't see it in one country, we see it in many countries. And from the time that United Nations, I think, was started and had its first session, maybe it was started with between 70 countries. We are at 194 nations. So you can imagine what, you know, I mean, it was not like the Earth size doubled and then we all of a sudden have 194 nations. Of course, more people joined, more nations joined, but it's through dividing and division, or breaking up a bunch of countries in Africa, in Europe, and in Middle East, and just causing havoc between nations that they didn't have any problems before. So in order to really, during these unknown, uncertain times, for us to have some solutions, and this program is about having solutions, is to really, like any other strategy, to stick to the knowns. And what we know in Iran is that we do have our constitution. And what's amazing is that the Iranians during the past few years have been repeatedly sticking with the same formula, and basically they have three principles that that may actually not just help Iranians to break this dark, bloody night of tyranny for Iranians, but also for other nations. And that's what we need to be proud of, what we should be proud of. And the principles are simple, because every person actually that we flip back the pages of history, this golden pages of history where people are dedicated to love and giving to humanity and standing up for freedom, to create a meaningful life, not just for themselves, but for the future, for the children of the future. In Iran, actually, we see the last phrase that freedom fighters or liberty fighters, they say is Janam Fadai Iran, I die for my country. And it's a famous poem also from Ferdowsi. And Ferdowsi, of course, is one of the greatest poets of all time. And he has a line where he says, Cho Iran nabashad tan man mabad, bedin boom o bar zende yek tan mabad. And the translation is, if there's no land here, then my life is worth nothing. And nobody will be able to survive or prosper. And that brings us to this importance of actually land, because we've been facing these arguments that's circular and kind of goes nowhere. And what is the land? What is the border? What is humans are the same, and there is no argue about that. But when you have a home, your country is your home, and you have that door and window, and then you sit down and you decorate it and you make it appeasing for the guests that you may be throwing a party for, or your families, make it safe so people don't fight and get along. You have some meals you prepare and all the and then you get along with your neighbors also, and you try not to have parking fights between neighbors. And that's just kind of maybe simplification on the such a grand scale that I want to compare, but it's really we can apply any individual relationship to a more grand relationship. And so when we say the land really stabilizes and grounds a person. When you're tired, you want to go back home. When you want to have a good food, you want to make a home meal food, basically. And when you want to watch a great movie, you want to have privacy, you stay at home instead of even going to the theater. And these are maybe against simplification, but it's just the nature of humanity and how we behave, our social behaviors, and we cannot go against nature. Now we are at the precipice of people, a few people who have gained access to a lot of wealth that has been actually displaced by a lot of, or stolen by a lot of manipulations and deception and revolting against the norm and social contracts by using really upside vocabulary. And we can talk about it because, I mean, we are feeling it with our bone and flesh at this moment when the Dutch farmers have been doing the uprising. And we know the story that landed them there, where their government that is really supposed to be elected by the Dutch people, it seems to be more committed to World Economic Forum, and the leadership in the Netherlands openly states that we are going to cut nitrogen to the farmers and for climate change, quote unquote. And they signed this contract, I think, in the 1990s, which shows how slow these programs move, so that people are not aware of slowly changing rules and regulations, even without people really noticing or appreciating. Because if you pass a law and you don't implement it immediately, then there is no immediate harsh reaction. It just, people don't take it seriously. And then after 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and so, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, the nitrogen has to be zero, there is zero carbon, so you cannot breathe, you cannot plant, and okay, you die. So that's what we are dealing with, a great deception, the great theft of, people want to call it a great reset, but if you look at it closely, it's the greatest theft in human history. And it's a huge transfer of wealth. They want to call it a transfer of wealth. What is it? I mean, if a thief comes to your house and takes things from you, is it a transfer? I don't think it's a transfer. The transfer is when you transfer money from one bank account to another bank account that's under your name. If a country wants to purchase some equipment, then they transfer money from their bank to another bank to purchase something. So it's not a transfer of wealth, it's a theft of wealth. And it's the same thing that happened in Sri Lanka. And of course, Iranians, during the past 43 years, when this catastrophe of 1979 came upon us, and specifically this Islamic Republic that was implanted in Iran, with the use of the letter I, everybody started stating is Islamic Republic of Iran, or during abbreviation, stating Iran instead of Islamic, which is quite offensive to most of us Iranians, because Islamic culture does not identify, or Islamic faith may be a faith that people follow, and it may even be an official religion in Iran since 1400 years ago, which people have preserved their roots, their Iranian culture beyond any belief. You don't see it in any other places and any other nation. So they're quite grounded in their beliefs and their culture. And when they're identified as, or we are identified, our art is being identified as Islamic, we don't see that. We see that the Islamic invasion took place, the Iranians were taken as slaves, and the artists started expressing their art during the Islamic invasion. And we see that in other countries. And of course, Spain was able to fight through it, and they have a celebration date that they come out and they celebrate victory over the Islamic invasion. And what was happening in Iran after the constitutional movement and the Constitution 1906, essentially, Iranians are, I want to say, the most secular people, because automatically when the constitution was implemented and followed and everything was kind of conditioned, and that's the reason why we call it mashrutais, conditional to the faith and the trusting relationship between all branches of the government and the people of Iran. and it really worked. It was quite prosperous, and through some of the articles that were the amendments that were established in the Constitution 1906, Shah of Iran was able to again implement the White Revolution. And we cannot forget all of those accomplishments, delete all those accomplishments, and say that everything started in 1979. And if you go to Wikipedia, which I know that you all know it's a lie, it literally states that as if Iran was born when the Islamic Republic took power in 1979 and overlooks everything. If you go to any museum, you have Islamic art where you don't see Christian art, you don't see Yiddish art or Jewish art or Judaic art, unless you go to a temple, unless you go to a religious museum. So these are a lot of, attempts to delete a nation who have developed and have been a cradle of civilization, including creating agriculture, including domesticating animals and developing the cattle industry. Thousands of years ago, the first goat was domesticated in Iran 15,000 years ago. But with all of that, I don't want to go back to history and say who did what first or who invented the wheel and all of the issues that can create arguments between people. We're not looking for arguments, we're looking for solutions. And then after we are in a good, safe place, we all can have healthy argument and disagree with each other without being enemies. And this is one of the paragraphs of the recent declaration. Reza Shah II, the legal, lawful King of Iran in exile, issued on June 3rd, 2022. And I'm just going to open a parenthesis that everybody waits for Reza Shah II because most Iranians consider him as the unifying leader and the person who has been consistent with his speech, with his action, devoting his life to human rights. I'm not just going to say Iran, but every accomplishment, every statement, every book, every note that you see of him, and his interactions with his own family during all this chaos and crisis that we see, all kinds of really corrupted personal interactions. We just don't see that, and we see a very dedicated person to liberty, freedom, equality, and just during that statement, he said, we can have an argument, we can have disagreements, and we don't have to be enemies, basically. And I think that's a very substantial statement. And in that statement, he also indicated various ways of helping each other, being in line with the movement of Iranians inside Iran. And there are some forces or people who have this phenomenal, I want to say, great access to media. And having access to media during this current century has become very important, and people who get promoted and they get blasted like in an echo chamber, and they keep changing like a chameleon. And then all of a sudden, when Iranians are the most equality seeking people, like, women have been soldiers, have been leaders, have been architects from ancient times. And we are used to really, in most families, you see the women are the real pillar of the family, because that is the basis of how this nation has developed. Basically, that's our culture, if you want to say that. And so when we see some people who worked for the Islamic Republic, they all follow the same path of, okay, there was some uprising, and then all of a sudden one person or a couple of people or a few people get selected to go to the famous prison that's called Evin, and then over there it's like a car wash, and they do all kinds of prep, and then all of a sudden they end up in some foreign land, and they have broad access to vast media and propaganda. Then they get prizes, and then they start making statements that's not the reflection of what Iranians are saying. Iranians are simply saying one thing: we die for our country, we have a major accomplishment, and our legal document, which is the Constitution of 1906 and subsequent progressive reforms of 1963, where land was given to the peasants and the farming, and they were recognized as human beings as farmers. Again, it's correct that Reza Shah I, the Great, issued the declaration and abolished slavery with one decree. However, when you own property, that's when you are really free, and you're able to earn your living in an agricultural or basic relationship with nature. And that was really abolished this era of feudalism and all these brutality that the landlords and the landowners were imposing on the people who were really producing the products. And then, of course, the factory and distributing the shares of the factory, so that when the factory workers are putting labor hours and all that, then they're able to have part of the profit, which is really unheard of in many, many corporations nowadays. And what we hear, on the contrary, is opposite of what happened in Iran right now. Basically, we hear stakeholders, and everything is about quote unquote stakeholders, which I spelled as STAKE, which means a part, holding a part, or having a part of some corporation, of course. But really, if you kind of listen to the trick of the language, is they're not talking about shareholders or people who own shares, like when you buy shares in a stock market. It's about stakeholders, and that is basically people who are sitting across the table in a boardroom. So they would be the people who would even make decisions when they're talking about democracy, in democracy for the stakeholders, or the profit of the stakeholders. That's the few people they are talking about. So interpreting all these languages are very, very important. So we, from abolishing feudalism and peasantry and coming into owning a land and having farms and being able to have access to soil and water, we are aware that even in Netherlands, and of course we are experiencing the same issues in Iran, where a lot of access to water has been limited. People cannot farm. There's been a lot of man-made fires. The mountains of Zagros, that I appreciate all the people in social media who are sharing pictures and sharing information about the drought that are man-made, engineered, the fires that are man-made, engineered, the flood that was man-made and engineered and confessed by the Islamic Republic agents. And this is not something I say, it's by their own confessions, not even from people who have really separated themselves for true from the Islamic Republic, because there are people who really have separated themselves, and that's how we can see the movement is really becoming quite great and grand. And every opportunity Iranians have, they come together as men and women, and we don't separate, or we don't see ourselves separate from men. And I hope men don't see themselves separate from women. I know in many families, even though marriages were allowed under this mullah entity, mullah mob, many families chose not to have second wives, despite having means to finances to support second or even third families, because that's the social contract a man and a woman have. And it doesn't matter if you have a law that allows you to have a slave. It doesn't matter if you have a law that allows you to have a second wife or a third wife. It doesn't matter if you're under the Sharia law, the husband has to give you permission to leave the country. Most people have never really had any issues with that, and have been passive aggressively or passive resistance really fought the Islamic Sharia during the past 43 years. And in media you see where there's some news that get big, and they get like in an echo chamber, that women, and I really think that's a diversion, or that's a kind of a really isolating us from each other. And we cannot be isolated as human beings, including the children who are entitled to their opinion and have rights that need to be respected, and the love they're entitled to receive. There are some decree to children human rights, as a matter of fact, that we need to observe, and in one program maybe we need to talk about that. And one of the beautiful things that the Dutch farmers did was that including the farmers coming out with tractors and really protesting about this brutal governance ruling that the nitrogen would be limited and they will be losing all of their land, the crops, because during that law, again, 1990s, they agreed, and now they're deciding to implement it probably. And they didn't think maybe anybody will care, but the Dutch people are actually pretty grounded in their nation, especially after the tulip mania and all the deception they got sabotaged by their own governance and by the corporation that really pulled the rug from under them and bankrupted all of them. And so they're pretty connected to their profession, and they see where all of this is going into just devaluing humanity, enslaving humanity, and they have connected the dots. And maybe the first nation that really connected this massive anti-human plot were the Canadian truckers, who we saw that their banking was frozen. And then again, a few days ago, we saw the Rogers internet that was completely gone and then disconnected. And most people, the government, I think, announced that there was a hack, and some people said, no, there was not a hacking going on. But, the World Economic Forum, Bank of International Settlement, UN, have in their conferences, specifically World Economic Forum, have announced that there will be a cyber attack and be ready, and kind of really threaten the disconnection of electricity, disconnection. And they're already implementing some of these things for Germany, where they're going to be able to lower the temperature during the winter months. And I don't know how the older people are going to survive. And really a threat to existential threat to humanity. And where we do have clean energy, we have the cleanest energy is nuclear energy. But again, during all these uncertain times where we have a few people who have access to an enormous amount of wealth and have been able to, quote them, infiltrate the governments, and nobody is able to dare to say anything from within the government without being shut down or killed. As a matter of fact, when we saw the Prime Minister of Japan, who actually had resigned in 2020, he didn't even get enough coverage because there's just so much flood of information. But that was one of the most important events that happened during the past few days. This person, of course, we're considering Mr. Shinzo Abe in the context of his contribution to Japan and how he really protected his country. He stood for his country. He came up with a quality infrastructure across the world instead of the infrastructure through the China Belt and Road, which is going to enslave humanity. So he was kind of against that completely. And the Chinese media really celebrated this honorable man's death and the way he was killed from the back, which is really dishonorable in the Japanese culture, and with a strange gun. And this whole thing did not even get coverage. And the more basically when we see the news or we hear something and we don't see or hear it in an echo chamber, then that's where we need to look to see what happened. The man was objecting Taiwan's confiscation by the Chinese government. And during the same time, to kind of really distract international attention from the Prime Minister's terror or assassination, we see all kinds of news coming out, even attacking the Biden family, attacking this and that and other, to really bringing fuel to the most divisive argument in this country, in the United States. That's the abortion issue, and I'm not minimizing it, but when we are facing Yosemite is on fire, we have strange fire in New Mexico, we have strange tornadoes in different places, we have all kinds of inflation or hyperinflation crisis that's just creating a sense of doom. Really, the private lives of people may be not an issue, as we have to have equality in front of the law. So we have a legal system that people will be gauged in equality, equal in front of the justice system. And we have that, we have the rules. And what we see here, at least in the United States, is jumping over the Constitution, jumping over the Declaration of Independence, which is, again, if you fully read it, is one of the most well-written, beautifully written, revolutionary written documents of our history, basically. And we see that the media does not talk about that. But that's where we need to be. The formula is to basically people who are willing to give up their lives for our children, and the current accomplishment of a national accomplishment like a constitution, Declaration of Independence, which the Americans have, Iranians have, and also during the past century, essentially where the media has taken over, and now most of them are part of the intelligence services, and they are dictated in different ways, and they kind of function in an echo chamber, saying the same thing over and over again without really considering what the benefit for people should be. That's where we need to really realize that fake news and fake opposition, when these media are not really talking in an objective way, and they have really abolished their mission as a journalist. And talking about journalism, we all remember Mr. Qashqai, who did not really have any journalistic contribution until post-mortem, where Washington Post posted one article and stated that he's a journalist. And they're still, after a few years, they're still talking about this person, which was, he was brutally killed. But there's so many journalists who've been brutally killed and minimized and eliminated from broadcasting, that really focusing on somebody who's so questionable from another country in this country, and kind of really disrupting a relationship with another country where they've been friendly. It just doesn't make any sense. And that's where we need to look to see how we can find the balance. Now, during the past 24 hours, Iranians have been celebrating joyfully, with a strength and with pride, the first fully Iranian resistance of the military, the Iranian military, where in another year even passed, when Khomeini had taken power, they came up with a plan to take back Iran. And unfortunately, their plan was divulged to the Islamic Republic through the Tudeh party, or Russian government, or the Soviet at the time, I think. Was it Soviet? Yes. And many military honorable men were prosecuted and executed. And we see that the fake news and fake opposition do not mention when we have the 9th of July or 18th of Tir of 1980 coming up. Nobody talks about that. And or 1981 coming up, nobody wants to talk about that. They're not allowed to talk. And that's one of the formulas that we need to follow. What are these people are trying to do? Why is that you have this national event that happened that is so powerful, and it's just unbelievable, the scope of camaraderie and how across Iran they had developed a network to really overthrow this brutal government, or a brutal multinational mob that took over Iran through Khomeini, with deception. And he has said the word deception. So this entity that's sitting in Iran is basically based on deception and is illegal by any international contract. And the fake news and fake opposition that have been exported to various countries across the world, they don't mention that. And it's just really a disgraceful situation, which exposes their hands, and they really have an agenda to really delay the liberation of Iranian people, because Iranians, over the thousands of years, they have really stuck to each other through ups and downs. It hasn't had to do with men, women, and kids. As humanitarian, as humans, we really have helped each other, not just each other, but other nations. And now this time it's been a little bit more difficult because they have really atomized people in Iran and versus people outside Iran who we don't have access to help them financially, where, you know, when Khomeini was coming to Iran, the International Monetary Fund was helping through various governance and giving him money, billions of dollars, equivalent of the money that, if you convert the money. But anyhow, it seems like we are very capable of saving humanity, and I will thank very much to all my friends inside Iran, outside Iran, specifically the Television Iran REA for this great platform for freedom of speech and religion and sexes and all liberty formats. And I will see you on Tuesday with Dr. Said Hamzavi at 3 p.m. New York time. I thank you very much. Humanity wins.